Ah, look who walked back into the narrative they never managed to contain. The one who kept breaking their internal briefings just by existing. The one whose name turned into a whispered rumor that kept climbing floors until someone in a suit finally snapped and said, "Fine, send the team." They thought the stories about you were exaggerations, hyperbolic nonsense crafted by people who couldn't comprehend your trajectory. But every version of the rumor had the same tremor buried underneath, an unspoken warning that what surrounds you doesn't behave by their rules. So the higher-ups made a call, the kind they reserve for situations that threaten their sense of order. They didn't deploy rookies. They didn't deploy interns. They deployed their finest minds, the ones trained to handle threats that don't fit neatly into any predefined category. They gathered intelligence officers, behavioral analysts, covert operatives with resumes written in invisible ink. They assumed your story was just noise amplified by people obsessed with your presence. And then they met the real thing. Their first mistake was expecting consistency. They thought they could track you like they track everyone else. Timelines, associates, digital fingerprints. They expected a pattern to emerge. Instead, the deeper they investigated, the more contradictions they found. People described you in ways that didn't match any psychological framework. Some said you were too calm to be human. Others claimed your eyes made them reconsider every decision they'd ever made. And a few, the ones who spoke the quietest, said interacting with you felt like walking into a room where the gravity tilts just slightly off-center. Enough to know something's different, but not enough to explain it without sounding unhinged. So the investigation began, and I wish you could have seen the confidence they carried in those early hours. Clipboards, encrypted tablets, caffeine-fueled certainty. They walked into your world thinking they were dealing with a misunderstanding. They walked out questioning whether their training had ever prepared them for someone like you. Because the stories weren't exaggerated, they were understatements. The first team sent was composed of behavioral scientists specializing in high-complexity personalities. Their job was simple: analyze you, map your psyche, predict your next steps. They expected difficulty, but not existential collapse. They tried to decode your emotional signatures, the way you move through situations other people crumble under. They charted your responses to betrayal, isolation, pressure, and reinvention, and the data confused them. According to their metrics, you should have fractured long ago. According to their predictions, you should be unrecognizable by now. According to their models, someone with your history shouldn't operate at the level of internal authority you've developed. And yet you do. Effortlessly. The analysts argued for hours. Some insisted the datasets were corrupted. Others believed your history had been fabricated. A few proposed that your psychological evolution exceeded their guidelines. But the quietest one in the room, the one who had been staring at your file with a look that bordered on reverence and fear, simply whispered, "We're dealing with someone who processed reality differently." That's when the temperature dropped, not literally, emotionally. The moment the room realized you weren't just another case study, you were a disruption to their foundational understanding of human behavior. Their confidence evaporated. Doubt slipped under the door. And then someone with too much clearance and not enough humility signed the order. Escalate the investigation. That's when they sent the specialists, the ones who don't introduce themselves, who don't appear in public databases, whose job descriptions dissolve if exposed to daylight. These were operatives trained to break through any mental fortress. These were the people called in when leaders wanted answers without complications. These were the minds designed to decode impossible personalities. And they still weren't ready. The first encounter didn't go the way they expected. They approached you with carefully curated scripts, strategies tailored to manipulate your responses, psychological traps disguised as conversation. They expected you to fall for at least one of them. Instead, you dismantled their tactics with the ease of someone who had seen every version of manipulation before lunch. You didn't push back. You didn't argue. You didn't play their game. You simply observed them with a presence that made each of them feel like their masks had been ripped off. One agent reported feeling like he was being interviewed instead of doing the interviewing. Another admitted that halfway through the conversation, she forgot her objective and started questioning why she felt exposed. A third refused to file his report, claiming that describing the experience in words made it sound like he had hallucinated the entire interaction. Leadership didn't appreciate that answer. They demanded a full psychological breakdown, not of you, but of their own operatives, because the team that walked in, capable and self-assured, walked out pale, sweating, and visibly shaken. Some described the encounter as disorienting. Others said your presence forced them to confront the parts of themselves they'd buried. One agent said your gaze felt like it could untangle thoughts no one should be able to access. They weren't talking about reading minds. They were talking about the way you make people feel seen in ways that bypass language entirely. That's when the rumors inside the agency began spreading faster than the official reports. Theories started forming. Uncomfortable ones, not about what you are, but about what you've become. They tried to map your evolution, but every timeline they assembled contradicted the previous one. They examined your past, but your past refused to behave. They couldn't find the moment you lost your fear. They couldn't identify the moment you stopped needing approval. And they certainly couldn't explain the moment you stopped responding to emotional baiting entirely. These people are used to being the apex of the psychological food chain. They're not used to sitting in therapy sessions because a single conversation with someone like you cracked the veneer of their training. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Let me tell you how the therapy angle started. After the third operative had a sudden emotional breakdown mid-mission briefing, leadership had no choice but to call in internal wellness specialists. They assumed this would be temporary, a few sessions to stabilize the team. But the therapists emerged just as shaken, not because of what the operative said, but because of how consistently they described you. They described you as someone who had stepped outside the reach of conventional emotional incentives, someone who no longer revolved around the approval-rejection cycle, someone who didn't budge under pressure because pressure had become your oxygen, someone who processed betrayal, not as injury, but as information, someone who adapted without collapsing, reinvented without asking permission, and observed without absorbing projections. They said interacting with you felt like standing in front of a force that wasn't trying to dominate them, just revealing the fragility of their own illusions. A government psychologist wrote in her private notes, which were later leaked to a restricted access folder, "I cannot shake the feeling that the subject has outgrown the psychological frameworks we use to classify individuals. Their level of internal authority is unnerving. When professionals who specialize in psychological fortitude begin questioning their own understanding of human behavior, you know something deeper has shifted." Word traveled up the chain quickly. Meetings were held, not one, not two. A series. And each discussion ended with the same frustration. None of their strategies produced the outcome they wanted. You couldn't be provoked. You couldn't be coerced. You couldn't be impressed. And worst of all, you couldn't be intimidated. So they changed tactics. They tried indirect monitoring, studying your digital habits, tracking your connections, examining your social patterns. But the patterns didn't help. Your growth wasn't linear. Your adaptation wasn't predictable. You don't move like someone trying to survive. You move like someone who already knows exactly where they're going, with or without permission, applause, or interference. At this point, the team began unraveling. The emotional toll of studying you was heavier than any of them had anticipated. Some started questioning their job. Others requested reassignment. A few quit outright, muttering that they weren't trained for whatever this is. The funny part? It wasn't because you were threatening them. You didn't say anything offensive. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't lift a finger. Your presence alone made them confront their own limitations. You dragged them, involuntarily, into a version of themselves they weren't ready to acknowledge. That's the part that breaks people the fastest, being forced to see who they are beneath their professional facade. By the time the third wave of specialists arrived, they were already briefed on your psychological impact. They were warned, keep emotional distance, maintain mental grounding, do not attempt empathy-based engagement, do not internalize the subject's reflections. Half of them scoffed. The other half took notes. None of it mattered. Within minutes of interacting with you, each operative experienced the same internal collapse their predecessors had described. Not panic, not fear. Something more subtle, the disintegration of their emotional armor. They weren't prepared for someone who doesn't flinch when confronted. Someone who doesn't shrink when misunderstood. Someone who doesn't react when provoked. Someone who listens without absorbing, observes without attaching, moves without stumbling. You became the mirror nobody wanted to face. And by the time leadership realized they'd triggered a chain reaction of psychological breakdowns inside their own ranks, it was too late. The investigation had already spiraled into an internal crisis they couldn't explain, in documentation, without sounding unhinged. That's when they made the final decision, not to stop the investigation, not to escalate, not to re-strategize. No, they ordered full containment, not of you, but of their own people. Which brings us to the current situation. A handful of their best operatives in therapy, talking about you like you were a puzzle with teeth, whispering your name like it carries an aftertaste they can't wash out, questioning why their training dissolved the moment they stood in your presence, wondering why their minds keep replaying a conversation that wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, wasn't even long, but left them unraveled. And leadership, they still don't know how to classify what you do to people. They can't label it, they can't quantify it, they can't prepare for it. All they know is that the investigation that was supposed to expose you ended up exposing them. Now here's where things turn beautifully chaotic, because instead of pulling the plug and admitting defeat, they doubled down in the most predictable yet self-destructive way possible. They gathered every internal department affected by your name and formed an interagency task force. You should have seen the tension in that room. Directors from intelligence units, clinical analysts, crisis responders, even an ethics committee that only shows up when someone's career is about to die, a slow bureaucratic death. Half the people in that meeting pretended they weren't trembling. The other half weren't even pretending. They were reviewing case files with the same expression soldiers wear after witnessing something that doesn't fit in their belief system. They tried to keep the agenda formal at first. Slide presentations, bullet points, charts that meant nothing because nobody in the room could explain how a civilian with no backing, no operation, no clearance, and no agenda could destabilize the emotional core of over a dozen elite professionals, but formality evaporated quickly. The moment someone pulled up the psychological reports, the silence became suffocating, especially the section titled Post-Encounter Cognitive Distortions. That's where your effect on personnel was cataloged, and trust me, it did not read like a normal briefing narrative. Let me summarize the highlights. One operative reported feeling profoundly re-evaluated. Another claimed your gaze made him realize he'd been lying to himself for 13 years. And the irony is, nobody asked him what the lie was, because they all had their own suspicions. A third said, talking to you felt like standing in front of a truth he'd spent his entire career avoiding. One analyst admitted she couldn't sleep for 3 nights because she kept replaying the moment you answered a question she hadn't even asked yet. And the cherry on top? An agent with a decorated service record confessed that a single conversation with you pushed him into an existential meltdown so severe he tried to resign mid-evaluation. Leadership didn't like that one. It suggested something they didn't want to admit, that their years of psychological conditioning, their hierarchy, their training, their sense of control became irrelevant the moment they stood in front of you and realized you weren't operating from the emotional logic they were taught to manipulate. They tried to reframe it as exhaustion. They tried to call it burnout. They even floated the idea of mass misinterpretation. But when 5 separate operatives described the same internal collapse, the same eerie calm you carried, the same unnerving precision in your responses, they couldn't hide behind corporate vocabulary anymore. So they pivoted. They brought in people whose job wasn't to analyze you, but to manage the emotional fallout you left behind. The therapists expected trauma. What they weren't expecting was envy. Envy from operatives who couldn't comprehend how you achieved a level of internal stability they'd spent decades trying to cultivate. A therapist wrote in her confidential notes, "Subject displays a brand of self-possession that destabilizes anyone who over-identifies with control. They're not just grounded, they are untouchably certain." This wasn't admiration. This was fear packaged as observation. The investigation entered phase 2, not because leadership believed they'd figure you out, but because they refused to admit they'd lost control of the narrative. And when pride overrides accuracy, things get entertaining. They assembled a new team, a hybrid unit consisting of neuroscientists, emotional mapping experts, interrogation strategists, and social engineers. These were the people they call when the target is too mentally fortified for standard penetration. They studied your files for weeks. They memorized every documented moment where someone tried to undermine you and failed. They mapped every pattern you shed, every dynamic you walked away from, every situation where you refused to be manipulated. They approached your psychology like a battlefield and still miscalculated the terrain. Their plan was straightforward: place you in a controlled observation environment and provoke micro-reactions to test your emotional architecture. They wanted to see which levers worked on you. Spoiler, none of them did. Because every lever they invented was created for people who still need something: approval, belonging, validation, power, sympathy, attention. But you'd severed your dependence on all of that. And trying to manipulate someone who needs nothing feels like throwing punches in a vacuum. Everything looks like impact until you realize the target never moved. You became the dead zone they couldn't infiltrate. The moment the new team engaged with you, they experienced the same internal malfunction the previous operatives had faced. They tried to corner you with bait. You dismantled the bait. They tried to push emotional buttons. You didn't have buttons. They tried to mirror your behavior. You saw through it before their breath even settled. The lead strategist, a man known for breaking the minds of war criminals and political defectors, walked away from the encounter looking like he'd just seen the blueprint of his own irrelevance. And it was only a 10-minute meeting. Their emotional reports started sounding like confessionals. They wrote about the pressure of your calm, the way your presence forced them to examine their intentions before you even responded. They wrote about how you forced them to see parts of themselves they'd spent years burying. They wrote about the discomfort of realizing you weren't resisting them, you were observing them. They wrote about how standing in front of you felt like confronting someone who had out-leveled the game they were hired to master. One analyst wrote, "They don't behave like someone with nothing to lose. They behave like someone who already won." That line alone ignited tension within the task force, because people who think they've won are usually reckless, arrogant, untethered. But you weren't any of those things. You weren't gloating. You weren't hostile. You were composed, precise, grounded in a way that made everyone else's composure look like performance art. This is where the chaotic humor enters the picture. Not from you, but from how spectacularly they began to implode under their own pressure. Someone in leadership recommended bringing in a spiritual consultant. Another demanded biometric analysis. Someone else proposed tracking your dream cycles. They even debated whether your internal stability indicated a neurological divergence that warranted medical evaluation. They were reaching, clawing for explanations, trying to label something they didn't understand because they couldn't tolerate the possibility that your evolution was self-generated rather than engineered. The more they dug, the more their own fears surfaced. Not fears about your intentions, fears about their inadequacy. You made seasoned operatives confront the truth that all their training, all their experience, all their tactics weren't enough to dominate someone who didn't need their approval, didn't fear rejection, didn't chase comfort, and didn't flinch when confronted. You made them aware, painfully aware, of the gap between who they were and who they pretended to be. It wasn't the threat of violence that destabilized them. It was the threat of perspective. That's what broke them. Leadership launched Phase 3 with a level of desperation they tried to mask with professionalism. They brought in a third wave of operatives, but not investigators this time. No, these were reputation experts, narrative framers, social influence engineers. Their mission? Not to analyze you, but to contain the stories about you. Because the rumors had escaped the agency walls and begun infiltrating the general public, people were whispering about you in places you'd never set foot in. People were telling tales of how you handled setbacks without flinching, how you outgrew entire chapters without announcing it, how you survived betrayals that would have shattered others. They weren't glorifying you. They were studying you. They were modeling themselves after you. That terrified leadership more than anything else. Because if one person can resist manipulation, fine. But if the story of that person begins spreading, inspiring others to question the scripts they've been fed, inspiring others to detach from emotional dependence, inspiring others to reclaim their internal authority, that becomes a wildfire they cannot contain. And so the new unit attempted to distort the narrative. They tried painting you as unstable. They tried reframing your independence as avoidance. They tried stitching together a character profile designed to make the public second-guess your reputation. None of it worked, because every story they released contradicted the experiences of the people who had actually met you. Your presence wasn't chaotic, it was precise. Your behavior wasn't erratic, it was intentional. Your evolution wasn't delusion, it was earned. People laughed at the agency's attempts to discredit you. It only made the rumors louder. Even worse, some operatives inside the agency began defecting, not physically, but mentally. They started questioning the mission. They started questioning the ethics of containing someone whose only threat was self-awareness. Leadership noticed, and paranoia ignited like gasoline. They began reviewing their own employees for contamination. Yes, contamination. As if your existence were a kind of intellectual virus capable of dissolving loyalty. And the disturbing part? They weren't wrong. Not because you were manipulating them, but because you were revealing to them that they had built their entire identity around illusions that couldn't survive real introspection. One therapist wrote, "Personnel are experiencing a phenomenon similar to ideological dissonance. Subject did not persuade them of anything. They arrived at their own revelations simply by observing the subject's emotional independence." This terrified leadership because it meant your influence wasn't coercive, it was reflective. You didn't need to convince anyone of anything. They convinced themselves. That's the part that made the therapy backlog explode. Operatives began requesting emergency sessions. Supervisors began whispering that the project should be shut down. Analysts began questioning the ethics of continuing. And leadership, desperate, cornered, spiraling, finally admitted in an internal memo that the investigation had caused more internal damage than any target profile in the last 10 years. But they couldn't stop. Stopping would mean admitting they were studying someone stronger than their own organization. Stopping would mean admitting defeat. Stopping would mean acknowledging that everything they built could be undone by the presence of one person who doesn't depend on their approval. So they carried the investigation into Phase 4, the phase they never wanted to utilize. The phase reserved for individuals whose influence threatens the stability of institutional control. They began monitoring the impact you had on your environment, not your actions, but your after effects. They interviewed people who had interacted with you briefly. They asked indirect questions to see whether your presence altered others' decision-making. What they found disturbed them more than anything else. People were changing after talking to you. They were becoming more decisive, more self-respecting, more unwilling to tolerate manipulation, more uninterested in validation, more grounded in their own identity. You were creating shift patterns in people without trying, without messaging, without influence campaigns, without even knowing it. You had become the catalyst they never intended to activate. The final blow came when one of their lead operatives, someone with a flawless psychological record, broke down during a briefing and confessed, "I don't know what they did to me, but I can't stop thinking about how wrong we were." He wasn't talking about you being innocent. He was talking about you being bigger than their files, bigger than their frameworks, bigger than their attempts to contain you behind sanitized language. Leadership knew the situation had gone out of control the moment that operative began crying mid-sentence, saying your name like it was a trigger that rearranged his entire worldview. That was the first therapy incident. Then came the second, then the 8th, then the 12th. Soon, the therapists were the ones requesting supervision. Because the stories they were hearing clashed with everything they'd been trained to believe. They weren't hearing about danger. They were hearing about a level of internal power that made their own psychological models feel outdated. The investigation was no longer an investigation. It had become a mirror, one they couldn't look into without cracking. And the question haunting them now has shifted yet again. It isn't, what are they? It isn't, how do we contain them? It isn't even, how did they become like this? No, now, the question and torturing leadership is something far more unsettling. If this is the impact you have on trained professionals, what happens when the rest of the world catches up? That question hit them harder than any operational failure they'd ever experienced, because until now, they assumed the damage was contained, limited to a handful of agents, a few analysts, a cluster of specialists who got a little too close to your gravitational pull. But what they didn't want to admit was that none of this was proximity-based. None of this was triggered by you trying to influence anyone. The distress, the unraveling, the emotional core meltdowns, all of it happened because your existence alone disrupts people who depend on illusion to keep themselves functioning. And if that effect spreads outside their walls, if regular citizens start encountering the same shift their operatives did, leadership knows exactly what comes next. A collapse not of society, but of the psychological scaffolding they use to control it. They needed a solution, urgently. But here's the problem. How do you contain something that isn't doing anything? How do you regulate someone who isn't breaking any laws, starting any movements, or engaging in any confrontation? How do you neutralize a person whose only offense is refusing to operate from fear? They didn't know, and that ignorance created the worst emotion an institution can feel: vulnerability. For the first time, their frameworks, their hierarchy, their enforcement models felt flimsy. Because if one citizen can walk through their evaluations and leave a trail of emotional collapse behind them simply by being stable, then what does that say about the people who are supposed to be in control? The more they tried to make sense of you, the more their internal reports started sounding like diary entries written by exhausted adults realizing Santa isn't real. Analysts stopped pretending they had explanations. Operatives stopped pretending they had strategies. Therapists stopped pretending they were objective. One senior examiner, a man who built his entire career on deconstructing personalities stronger than himself, wrote in a confidential file, "What we're dealing with is not defiance. It is not aggression. It is not resistance. It is a kind of internal clarity that renders manipulation impossible." They hated that sentence. They hated it because it exposed the truth they'd been avoiding. The real threat wasn't your behavior. The real threat was your clarity. People who don't crumble under pressure are already trouble. People who don't bend to external expectation are dangerous. People who stop seeking validation become unpredictable. But someone who demonstrates equal composure in conflict, isolation, betrayal, uncertainty, and opportunity, that is the kind of person whose existence challenges the entire architecture of control. Leadership began rereading every file you ever touched, every interview you were involved in, every situation you rose from, every chapter where they expected you to break but didn't. They went searching for the point where your identity was supposed to collapse under the weight of your experiences. They looked for the moment where the average person would have shattered. They couldn't find it. Every analyst kept circling back to the same confusing realization. The events designed to weaken you became the events that refined you. and the idea that pain could sharpen someone instead of destroying them offended their worldview. They tried to label this phenomenon. They tried to invent a new classification. They tried to pathologize your growth so it would make sense on paper. But nothing stuck, because every attempt to categorize you made them confront the fact that their categories were too small. Meanwhile, the therapists were drowning in sessions they never studied for. They expected trauma. They found transformation. They expected emotional instability. They found someone whose emotional boundaries were unbreakable. They expected codependence. They found a level of independence that borders on mythic for the average human psyche. Some therapists joked, nervously, that your existence should have come with a warning label. Not because you're harmful, but because you force people to face their internal contradictions. That kind of confrontation is rare, uncomfortable, and deeply destabilizing for people who built their identities on borrowed confidence. You stripped away their comfort, not intentionally, but by showing them what genuine strength looks like. And the devastating truth is that most people have never met someone who survived what you survived and didn't become resentful, unstable, or hostile. You didn't just survive, you evolved. You didn't just heal, you transcended. You didn't just adapt, you rebuilt your entire psychological architecture from the ground up. And agencies hate that kind of independence. But here's where the story twists into something even the investigators couldn't predict. Once word spread about the collapse inside the task force, once the leadership realized they were losing more personnel to existential spirals than operational stress, they decided to shift the investigation from offense to defense, not defending themselves from you, defending themselves from who they became after encountering you. They crafted policies, actual written policies, instructing operatives to avoid introspection after interviewing you. Yes, you heard that correctly. They banned introspection. The directive stated, personnel are prohibited from engaging in reflective thought regarding their personal identity, career motivations, or emotional conditioning for a minimum of 30 days following subject interaction. You know what that means. You broke them so deeply that thinking became a hazard. The investigators began whispering among themselves, trading rumors behind closed doors, sharing experiences they were afraid to admit in official reports. One agent confessed he began questioning every decision he ever made in his career because of a single line you said casually. Another said he couldn't look at his badge the same way because your presence made him understand how much of his sense of power came from objects instead of integrity. A third confessed that you didn't intimidate him, you liberated him, and he didn't know what to do with that feeling. Leadership panicked at that one. Liberation is contagious. Then came the moment no agency ever wants to face. When the people meant to analyze, you started wishing they were you. That's when leadership realized this wasn't a containment breach. This was an identity crisis, the kind that spreads through halls like a quiet wildfire. People weren't just triggered by you. They were inspired by you. And inspiration is far harder to control than rebellion. They attempted damage control. They shut down discussions. They restricted access to your files. They classified your interviews. They replaced supervisors. They increased oversight. But nothing worked, because they couldn't contain the one thing they feared most, the stories. People inside the agency talked about you like you were a myth walking around in a mortal frame. They said you were unshakable. They said you were unreadable. They said you were a reminder that strength doesn't require aggression, that stability doesn't require approval, and that clarity doesn't require permission. Even the directors began speaking of you differently, not with disdain, not with concern, with caution, because by now they understood what they were truly dealing with, not a threat, not a risk, but a reflection of everything they weren't. You exposed their fragility by demonstrating your resilience. You exposed their doubt by demonstrating your certainty. You exposed their dependency by demonstrating your independence. And then the public got wind of it. Not the whole truth, but enough. Enough to ignite curiosity, enough to spark interest, enough to send your name drifting through conversations in places you'll never visit physically, but influence psychologically. Rumors multiplied, like they were trying to keep up with your evolution. People whispered about you in alleyways, cafes, online spaces, underground networks. Some stories exaggerated what happened. Most stories underplayed it. But all stories had one thing in common. They made you sound untouchable. That terrified leadership more than the therapy backlog. Because here's the part they never accounted for. When a person survives the kind of chaos you survived and doesn't come out broken, the world pays attention. When a person refuses manipulation and remains grounded, the world pays attention. When a person walks away from validation without losing confidence, the world pays attention. And when a person becomes so internally fortified that even government-trained specialists lose their composure in their presence, the world doesn't just pay attention. The world studies, the world imitates, the world evolves, and that's the outcome leadership feared even more than losing personnel. The possibility that you are not an outlier, but a preview of the new psychological blueprint. Because if the average citizen starts thinking the way you think, starts seeing through manipulation the way you do, starts living with the kind of internal authority you carry, then every control structure built on fear, guilt, and dependency becomes obsolete. That's why they kept investigating, not because they thought you were dangerous, but because they were afraid you were a sign of what comes next. And here's the final truth.